Integrated Psychotherapeutic Coping and Resilience Inventory, IPCRI, Gray Integrated Revision. By Roel Katch-Abstract, this IMRED revision anchors the IPCRI's conceptual basis on Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory, RST, which explains how underlying neuropsychological systems, behavioral inhibition, BIS, and behavioral activation, BAS, govern coping, emotion regulation, and resilience. The inventory integrates ACE, COPE, DBT, and engagement domains to capture how trauma exposure activates BIS responses, anxiety avoidance, and how coping and DBT skills strengthen BAS pathways, approach regulation, goal pursuit. Internal consistency remained acceptable to excellent, =.82, 0.91, with high content validity, CVR 0.84, 0.89, CVI 0.90, 0.94. This study explores how national integrity, trauma, and personal resilience interact in the Filipino experience. Drawing from Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory, the narration explains how two core neuropsychological systems, the behavioral inhibition system, or BIS, and the behavioral activation system, or BAS, shape how people respond to stress. When individuals experience conflict, fear, or uncertainty, the BS system becomes active. This often leads to anxiety, avoidance, and emotional overload. In the context of collective crises, political instability, corruption, or social stress, this BIS activation becomes widespread, affecting community well-being. However, the BIS system allows for motivation, progress, and hope. When coping strategies are strengthened, especially through DBT skills, problem-solving, and positive engagement, BAS activation supports resilience. It helps people push forward, regain control, and rebuild their sense of purpose. The IPCRI bridges psychometric assessment with real-life Filipino experiences. By integrating ACE, COPE, DBT, and engagement domains, it captures how trauma elevates BIS responses and how adaptive coping strengthens BAS. The result is a clearer understanding of how resilience is formed, not just individually, but within communities, navigating uncertainty. Ultimately, This narration frames resilience as a dynamic balance between vulnerability and strength.
Kumu teacher, Roel Katch created the Integrated Psychotherapeutic Coping and Resilience Inventory, IPCRI, that brings together four major frameworks: Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACE, the Brief Cope Model, Dialectical Behavior Therapy, DBT, and Gray's Reinforcement Sensitivity Theory, RST, to provide a unified lens for understanding trauma, coping, and emotional regulation among Filipinos. By integrating these systems, the IPCRI captures how early adversity, stress exposure, and learned coping patterns interact with deeper neuropsychological mechanisms. Grounded in RST, the instrument accounts for two core motivational systems: the Behavioral Inhibition System, BIS, associated with anxiety, avoidance, and sensitivity to punishment, and the Behavioral Activation System, BAS, linked to motivation, reward, and adaptive engagement. Trauma exposure typically heightens BAS functioning, while effective coping strategies and DBT-based skills strengthen BAS pathways, supporting resilience and recovery. A pilot study of the IPCRI, N=20, ages 18 to 75, balanced gender, demonstrated excellent psychometric qualities, with internal reliability ranging from alpha equals 0.82, 0.91, and strong content validity. CVR equals 0.84, 0.89. CVI equals 0.90, 0.94. These findings suggest that the IPCRI is a robust, culturally sensitive assessment tool suited for multigenerational and multicultural contexts. It effectively captures the interplay between trauma history, coping strategies, and the motivational emotional dynamics that shape personal resilience. Understanding the Filipino psychological landscape requires tracing the subtle pathways through which early adversity reshapes the mind, the body, and the social world. Childhood stressors, whether rooted in family instability, exposure to conflict, emotional neglect, or chronic economic hardship, do more than leave emotional impressions. They set into motion long-term neurobiological patterns that influence how a person meets future challenges. Within this context, the ACE framework functions as a map of developmental vulnerabilities, outlining the ways in which formative disruptions sensitize individuals to threat, undermine trust, and heighten physiological reactivity. DBT's core skill sets, mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotional modulation, and interpersonal effectiveness, introduce counterweights to these early imprints. When practiced consistently, they help reorganize internal states, offering structure where chaos once dominated. Alongside DBT, the brief COPE inventory highlights habitual cognitive styles. Some individuals gravitate toward reframing and problem-solving, while others move toward withdrawal, rumination, or emotional suppression. These tendencies often mirror the person's early environmental demands and reinforce their unique patterns of response. At the neurological level, Gray's model provides a powerful lens for interpreting these behaviors. A person whose past reinforced vigilance or punishment becomes more sensitive to BIS activation, resulting in rapid threat detection, defensive postures, and difficulty accessing curiosity or relational openness. In contrast, BS thrives in environments where effort is rewarded, safety is predictable, and relationships are stable. When BS predominates, individuals show greater initiative, emotional energy, and capacity for hopeful action. In Filipino communities, these systems do not operate in isolation. Cultural expectations around resilience, sacrifice, collective responsibility, and emotional restraint blend with socioeconomic realities, creating layered motivational landscapes. People learn to survive hardship through humor, spirituality, family cohesion, and adaptive improvisation, strategies that often function as organic forms of emotional regulation. Resilience, therefore, emerges not as a fixed trait, but as a negotiated process that evolves with each new context. The IPCRI captures these converging forces, illustrating how trauma, coping, and neuropsychological activation shape behavior across the lifespan. Understanding human resilience requires more than describing emotional reactions. It requires tracing how sensory, cognitive, and relational systems shape the way individuals adapt to hardship. The Integrated Psychotherapeutic Coping and Resilience Inventory, IPCRI, approaches this task by synthesizing four major domains: adverse childhood experiences, ACE, dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, skills, brief cope strategies, and Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory, RST. These components give structure to a developmental arc that begins with adversity, moves through emotional regulation, and culminates in motivated engagement. This first section of the 9,000-word narration lays the foundation by exploring the early influence of ACE, the subsequent activation of the behavioral inhibition system, BIS, and the first phase of recovery through DBT and COPE. It articulates the psychological mechanisms that shape adaptive behavior and the reasoning behind the IPCRI design. Section A: Early Experience and the Formation of Fear Patterns. Adverse childhood experiences create strong impressions on the developing nervous system. These experiences vary widely. The unpredictability of household routines, unpredictable adult behavior, chronic exposure to stress, insufficient emotional support, or inconsistent caregiving. Even without overt violence, these environments subtly influence neural circuitry. The human brain adapts to perceived danger by strengthening pathways dedicated to threat detection, thereby prioritizing survival over exploration. The diagram associated with the IPCRI model positions ACE on the far left because it represents the origin point for many emotional and behavioral tendencies observed later in adulthood. Under stressful or chaotic circumstances, BIS becomes active. This system operates as a biological alarm designed to prevent harm by inhibiting action until safety is assured. While protective in acute danger, BIS becomes problematic when activated continuously. Consider a child growing up in a household where shouting is common. Although physical aggression may not occur, the sound of conflict becomes a powerful cue that triggers physiological arousal. Over time, the child's nervous system becomes conditioned to anticipate negative outcomes. This expectation shapes behavior, withdrawing from social situations, hesitating before speaking, or avoiding challenging tasks. These behavioral patterns are not choices, but survival strategies rooted in neural learning. Section B: Trauma, Memory, and the Internalization of Threat. Traumatic or stressful experiences leave a lasting imprint on memory. The hippocampus, responsible for contextualizing information, becomes sensitive to emotional cues. The amygdala, responsible for detecting threat, may respond intensely even when no real danger is present. When fear becomes habitual, the brain begins to treat uncertainty as inherently unsafe. This internalized sense of threat explains why many individuals with high ACE scores display similar characteristics. Hesitation, difficulty establishing trust, challenges with emotional expression, and heightened sensitivity to conflict. These traits represent adaptive responses to unpredictable environments. When the BIS is constantly activated, it shapes cognition in several ways. Attention becomes focused on potential risk rather than possibility. Memory prioritizes negative cues, reinforcing guardedness. Imagination becomes limited to worst-case scenarios. Confidence weakens as action becomes associated with potential harm. These processes demonstrate why ACE occupies such a critical place in psychological development. It is not merely a list of experiences. It reflects an entire learning environment that influences personality formation, emotional tone, and motivational disposition. Section C, DBT and COPE as bridges between fear and motivation. The central portion of the IPCRI diagram depicts DBT and COPE as the mechanisms that regulate BS. These therapeutic approaches help individuals shift from fear-based functioning toward a more balanced emotional state. DBT equips individuals with skills for distress tolerance, emotional regulation, mindfulness, and effective communication. COPE strategies complement these skills by introducing cognitive flexibility, restructuring, and approach-oriented problem-solving. A person shaped by early adversity often requires both sets of tools. Emotional regulation reduces arousal, and cognitive strategies provide structure for reinterpreting experiences. For example, an individual who grew up expecting criticism may interpret neutral feedback as rejection. DBT skills would help reduce the emotional intensity of the moment, while COPE strategies would allow the person to examine the feedback realistically. Section D, the calming of BIS through skill practice. The diagram shows an arrow directing influence from DBT plus COPE back into the regulatory centers of the brain. This visual communicates that emotional change is not passive. It arises through repeated skill practice. As individuals develop greater tolerance for discomfort, the BIS gradually becomes less reactive. Mindfulness helps the person distinguish between present reality and past associations. Reappraisal techniques help reorganize meaning. Step-by-step problem solving helps generate solutions where previously there were none. This gradual decrease in BIS reactivity is essential for later activating BIS. Without regulating the fear system, the motivational system cannot rise. When fear dominates, motivation is suppressed. The two systems, BIS and BAS, compete for cognitive and emotional resources. The IPCRI diagram highlights that healing begins with calming the fear-based system first. Section E, lived examples of BIS calming. Imagine a young adult who has spent years avoiding social interactions. Early life experiences taught them that expressing needs leads to conflict. In therapy, they learn DBT's, check the facts strategy, which helps differentiate memory from present data. They also learn grounding techniques to reduce physiological arousal when interacting with others. Over time, the BIS quiets enough for the individual to attempt social engagement. Another example is an adolescent who has always viewed academic tasks as overwhelming. Through mindfulness, they learn to break tasks into manageable steps. Through COPE strategies, they develop self-instruction routines that encourage persistence. The BIS becomes less dominant, allowing the adolescent to attempt tasks previously avoided. Section F, the transition toward motivation. The IPCRI model positions DBT and COPE directly before BIS activation because these skills create the mental environment necessary for motivation to emerge. Fear must be reduced before hope can return. Individuals who successfully regulate BIS begin to feel capable. They are no longer overpowered by internal alarms. This shift marks the beginning of BIS activation. Graph 1, Philippines, CPI and suicide rate, 2000 to 2025. The first graph presents two time series curves, a yellow line representing the national suicide rate per 100,000 population, and a gray dashed line representing the Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI. CPI ranges from 0 to 100, where higher numbers denote cleaner governance and stronger institutional credibility. A clear inverse relationship is visible across 26 years of data. When CPI increases, indicating lower corruption, the suicide rate gradually declines. Conversely, when corruption perception worsens, the suicide rate tends to rise. This pattern is confirmed by statistical regression values. Beta is almost equal to -0.062, and R is almost equal to -0.89, demonstrating a strong negative association. The early 2000s show erratic CPI values and correspondingly unstable suicide rates around 5.2 to 5.4. However, from 2015 onward, CPI steadily climbs due to improvements in transparency and accountability, and suicide rates fall below 4.8 per 100,000, suggesting a public trust recovery period. From a psychological perspective, this reflects governance functioning as a macro-level regulator of national emotional climate. When citizens perceive institutions as fair, predictable, and trustworthy, collective stress decreases and population-wide mental health indicators stabilize. Clean governance, in this interpretation, acts as a societal antidepressant. Graph 1, Philippines, CPI and suicide rate, 2000 to 2025. The first graph presents two time series curves, a yellow line representing the national suicide rate per 100,000 population, and a gray dashed line representing the Corruption Perceptions Index, CPI. CPI ranges from 0 to 100, where higher numbers denote cleaner governance and stronger institutional credibility. A clear inverse relationship is visible across 26 years of data. When CPI increases, indicating lower corruption, the suicide rate gradually declines. Conversely, when corruption perception worsens, the suicide rate tends to rise. This pattern is confirmed by statistical regression values. Beta is almost equal to -0.062, and R is almost equal to -0.89, demonstrating a strong negative association. The early 2000s show erratic CPI values and correspondingly unstable suicide rates around 5.2 to 5.4. However, from 2015 onward, CPI steadily climbs due to improvements in transparency and accountability, and suicide rates fall below 4.8 per 100,000, suggesting a public trust recovery period. From a psychological perspective, this reflects governance functioning as a macro-level regulator of national emotional climate. When citizens perceive institutions as fair, predictable, and trustworthy, collective stress decreases and population-wide mental health indicators stabilize. Clean governance, in this interpretation, acts as a societal antidepressant. Graph 2, Ceramax Forecast, 2023 to 2029. The second graph extends the analysis using Ceramax forecasting. The solid yellow line covers real historical data from 2000 to 2022, while the dashed yellow line presents the model's projected suicide rates from 2023 to 2029. The forecast shows a continued gradual decline in suicide rates, provided that CPI keeps improving. The Ceramax model, 1-0-0 with CPI as the exogenous variable, confirms that corruption perception is a statistically significant predictor of suicide fluctuations. When corruption levels continue to drop and governance maintains transparency, trust, and accountability, the model anticipates ongoing improvements in population mental health. In short, better governance today predicts fewer suicides tomorrow. Slide 1, Gray BIS/BAS Cultural Pilot Study, RRC 2025. This slide shows synthetic pilot data from 4 cultural groups, American, Visayan, Ilocano, and Polynesian, using Gray's Behavioral Inhibition System, BIS, Behavioral Activation System, BAS, and the Reward Responsiveness, BASRR, and Fun-Seeking, BAS Fun components. The graph demonstrates the motivational differences across groups. Americans score higher in BS drive, showing strong goal pursuit and low hesitation. Bisayans show balanced BIS/BS patterns, meaning they pursue goals while staying aware of risks. Ilocanos have high BIS and high BS reward responsiveness, meaning they are motivated by praise yet cautious under threat. Polynesians show high BASRR and relational motivation, thriving on recognition and group harmony. The error bars indicate natural variation, but show clear cultural differences in motivation, cautiousness, and reward sensitivity. Slide 2 Cultural Personality Map plus Gray BIS/BS/FFFS interpretation. This slide synthesizes pilot data into a cultural personality framework. It integrates BIS, caution, conflict monitoring, anxiety; BS drive, goal pursuit; BS reward responsiveness, positive feedback sensitivity; FFFS, fight/flight/freeze, threat reactivity. Interpretation per cultural group. Americans, high BS drive, low FFFS, showing initiative and low fear response. Bisayans, balanced BS drive and moderate FFFS, indicating thoughtful action. Ilocanos, high BIS and BHRR with higher FFFS, meaning they are reward-driven but cautious and sensitive to threat. Polynesians, high BHRR with moderate FFFS, cooperative and relationship-oriented. This slide maps cultural motivations into a coherent psychological model that explains behavior, learning, coping, and emotional responses. Slide 3. Ilocano versus Bisayan in Hawaii plus OFW demographics. This slide explains why cultural psychology matters for Filipino communities. 1. Language demographics in Hawaii, ACS 2018 to 2022. Ilocano speakers make up 92.9% of Filipino language households. Bisayan speakers account for only 7.1%. Therefore, Ilocano cultural psychology shapes the majority of Hawaii's Filipino community. 2. U.S. Filipino populations. Ilocano and Visayan speakers are small groups nationally. This makes Hawaii unique for having a strong Ilocano cultural concentration. 3. Overseas Filipino workers, OFWs. Breakdown shows many work in high-stress jobs. 37.6% elementary occupations. 18% service and sales. 13.7% machine operation. 11.4% craft-related trades. Only 8.7% are professionals. 4. Global diaspora. 10 million Filipinos abroad. A 1.97 million land-based OFWs. Psychological significance. Ilocano individuals, reward-driven but threat-sensitive, often endure high-pressure work environments abroad. This may influence stress, coping, and family dynamics across generations. Understanding BIS/BAS/FFFS patterns helps predict emotional resilience, mental health risks, and school behavior in diaspora contexts. Together, these three slides connect cultural psychology, migration patterns, everyday motivation, and real-world community mental health. Integrated Results Summary, CPI, Suicide Trends, IPCRI Pilot, and Cultural BIS/BAS Profiles. This document synthesizes key quantitative and qualitative findings across multiple datasets, focusing on corruption trends, suicide rate patterns, resilience mechanisms, and cultural differences in reinforcement sensitivity. The purpose is to present results without graphical elements while maintaining conceptual precision and avoiding unnecessary repetition. CPI, Suicide Relationship Results. Higher transparency corresponds with lower national distress levels. Rising CPI aligns with declining suicide incidents. Regression analysis demonstrates a negative slope close to -0.062, indicating that each improvement in governance integrity predicts a measurable decrease in risk. Correlation strength reaches approximately -0.86. Reflecting a stable inverse association across 2 decades of observation. Forecast modeling suggests continued improvement if institutional trust advances further. Temporal pattern findings. From 2000 to 2005, stagnation in transparency corresponded with increased distress. Between 2006 and 2012, partial reforms stabilized public sentiment. From 2013 through 2016, inconsistent governance reflected fluctuating distress. Slight improvements between 2017 and 2020 led to minimal stabilization. Stronger reforms between 2021 and 2025 produced a modest decline in suicide rates, indicating that restored trust supports national emotional resilience. IPCRI Pilot Summary. Mean scores across domains reveal moderate to high engagement tendencies and consistent coping application. ACE shows elevated exposure, while DBT and COPE subscales reflect structured skill use. Engagement demonstrates strong reinforcement towards recovery-related action. Reliability estimates vary, with COPE showing the highest internal consistency. Cultural reinforcement sensitivity results. Americans demonstrate pronounced approach motivation. Visayans show balanced caution and goal pursuit. Ilocanos exhibit cautious responsiveness with high reward sensitivity. Polynesians display calm, cooperative behavioral patterns with strong responsiveness to recognition. Distinct reinforcement tendencies suggest culturally shaped motivational patterns that influence stress response and coping style. Qualitative overlays. Institutional stability exerts a broad psychological effect. Enhanced governance corresponds with collective relief, whereas uncertainty heightens vigilance. Strengthened trust supports regulation of internal conflict signals, reinforcing adaptive pathways and reducing distress. Conclusion: governance integrity, trauma exposure, coping strategies, and cultural reinforcement patterns together shape resilience outcomes. Results indicate consistent inverse alignment between corruption and psychological wellness, confirm the utility of cross-level analysis, and highlight the protective nature of engagement-driven behavioral activation.